Hello my friends, and welcome back to another video where today we are going to be discussing who is, quote, the greatest villain that ever flowed from Tolkien's pen, and the villain that we will be seeing in the upcoming Amazon Lord of the Rings TV series. And that quote that I mentioned earlier is directly from the synopsis of the Amazon Lord of the Rings TV series, which was leaked a few days ago. And online and on social media and throughout the Tolkien fandom, there have been a lot of discussions and debates on who is this greatest villain from Tolkien's works, and it must mean this character or must mean that character then. And we're going to be discussing this in today's video, as actually quite an interesting topic and why Amazon phrased it like this, and we'll be discussing why they phrased it. And also I believe that there is of course a definitive answer and a clear answer to this debate as well, but we're actually going to be first discussing and going through all the characters who this might be. So I believe that only two characters that can fit this description are in fact Morgoth / Melkor and Sarwan / Annatar. But firstly, let's start off with Morgoth, who can easily be debated as the most greatest villain in Tolkien's works, with the greatest villain part being directly quoted from the synopsis. But I'm sure many of you already know about Morgoth, or if you do not know, Sarwan was a lieutenant under Morgoth, and Morgoth was one of the, or if not the main character during the first years and basically the first age of Beleriand and Aman. And during that time, he was the main reason for the sinking of Beleriand and all of the battles and wars that commenced in the first stage. And his storyline with the Silmarils and all of the characters he had to face, even later on, basically, if Dagor is said to be true, the greatest villain, which is in fact Morgoth, comes back from the void, and actually there's one final battle, which shows how important and how that Morgoth is basically the greatest villain. And there's no doubt that Morgoth is in fact more powerful than Sarwan, as Sarwan was only a Maya, but Morgoth was in fact a Valar and actually went against the words of Iluvatar and wanted to have his own say on Aman. Even the consequences and after effects of the wrath of Morgoth can be seen into the third and fourth and second ages of Middle-earth, as that due to him and due to when the word of Aman was even sung by Iluvatar and everyone else, Morgoth in fact sung all the more darker and more evil things into the world. And because of that is why even into third and fourth age there is all this evil and chaos, so he can easily be blamed for that. So surely you must be thinking after that, Morgoth has to be the greatest villain in Tolkien's works. However, on the other side of the debate, we of course have Sarwan, and probably to the general public and audience who don't know a lot about Tolkien's works, they would easily believe that it has to be Sarwan, and Sarwan has to be the greatest villain in Tolkien's works, because they probably don't know a lot about Morgoth. But even within the Tolkien community, there's been lots of debates on whether who is the greatest villain, Sarwan or Morgoth. So here is, I believe, more of a defense for Sarwan. So we knew that he was in fact a lieutenant under Morgoth, and he was also a shapeshifter, and he did have quite interesting, and he wasn't too impactful on the first age. There was a bit of his influence on the story of Beren Luthien, but there wasn't too much of an impact on the first stage. And we did say that Morgoth had a big part to play in the sinking of Beleriand, but we also know that Sarwan has a big part to play in the sinking of Numenor and the distrust between the elves. And some may say that Sarwan does have, in the end, more of a bigger influence and had more of an impact in a more of a villain way on Middle-earth and Aman, because he rose to power a few times, and he was never really properly successful. Maybe for a time period throughout the Wars of Region he was successful for a bit, but he was never never truly successful, but neither was Morgoth. There's always a debate to be had there as well. But some people even say that Sauron's storyline was more interesting as well, and he had a better story arc, because originally he was a lieutenant under Morgoth. As we said, he worked under Ayule when back in Aman, and of course he's probably had maybe potentially the better storyline, and some may say Morgoth has a more interesting storyline, some may say Sauron has a more interesting storyline, but what we're discussing is who is the greatest villain. And we know, I believe that, or I don't believe, but for Sauron's side of the debate, you may say that he had a bigger impact on Middle-earth, and what he wanted to do was more, he was able to rise to power more times, as we know that Morgoth at the end of the first stage was banished and sent off into the void. And we know that at the end of the third age, Sauron was probably permanently, his spirit was destroyed. So both villains were unsuccessful, but Sauron could potentially had more success. So finally, back to the original question of who was the greatest villain that ever flowed from Tolkien's pen, and who is the villain that we'll be seeing in the upcoming Amazon Lord of the Rings TV series. So I believe it depends on what interpretation of quote greatest villain that Amazon are referring to, as yes, Morgoth was potentially the more powerful villain, as he was a Valar and probably was more powerful than Sauron. So in that interpretation of greatest, where he was the mightiest and strongest and more powerful villain, yes, that is Morgoth. But I believe they're thinking about Tolkien's legacy. So after the books were published and after Tolkien's death, 70-80 years time on now, who is the greatest villain that Tolkien ever wrote? Has to be Sauron. And this is due to who Amazon are targeting, the general audience who don't know a lot about Tolkien's works. And if you ask them, oh, who is the villain from Tolkien's works or Lord of the Rings, they will say Sauron, as I believe by greatest villain they mean the villain from Tolkien's works who has had the greatest influence after his death and after his works have been released, and that has of course been Sauron, as you cannot deny that Sauron is in fact the more famous villain, and I believe that's what Amazon are referring to. He is technically the greatest villain ever flowed from Tolkien's pen that Tolkien wrote, due to how famous he is, as we saw him in the adaptation of Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, we saw him in the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings, we saw him a bit in The Hobbit. Everybody knows about Sauron and everything about him, but the general audience don't know as much about Morgoth. But with us within our Tolkien community, we do know a lot about Morgoth. We knew that technically that statement may be incorrect, but that depends on your interpretation of greatest villain. As yes, Morgoth was more powerful than Sauron and potentially had a bigger effect, a greater effect on Aman. Sauron, after all these years later, is the villain that everybody remembers, and technically Tolkien's most successful villain. So I believe the main takeaway from this video is that this synopsis was not necessarily targeted at us, the hardcore Tolkien fandom, and that's probably due to, I don't believe Amazon wanted it to be released through the One Ring net, so that must have been a bit of a surprise to them. They probably wanted to release this and target that general audience, and wants to bring in those normal television, maybe fantasy enjoyers that don't know too much about Tolkien's works, but hey, they do know about Sauron. And even though 70-80 years later after Tolkien's death, people still remember Sauron more over Morgoth, and by greatest villain, but from Tolkien's pen. I believe that even that Tolkien's pen thing is quite interesting as well, because they didn't say the greatest villain in Aman or the greatest villain in Tolkien's works, but flowed from Tolkien's pen, which means that it has to be the villain that is more remembered, etc. And I think another good way to put this in example is that maybe for Tolkien, his greatest work was the Silmarillion, but overall, after his legacy, his greatest work was the Lord of the Rings. And I think that's the same thing with Morgoth and Sauron, and a good example that you may compare it to as well. And one final point which I've left to the end purposely because the most obvious point, but is in fact that Morgoth is not in the Second Age and the show is set within the Second Age. And we know that Amazon can't contradict Tolkien's works, as we learned that from Thomas Shippey last year, or I think 2 years ago now. But if Morgoth was involved in the Second Age, that is probably, it is contradicting Tolkien's works. And it is obvious that Sarwan is in the Second Age and his events are so much, and the impact he has on the Second Age is so great, for example through the sacking of Eregion, downfall of Numenor, and the war of the elves and Sarwan, etc. So it all points to Sarwan and not Morgoth, but it's interesting to have that little discussion as well. But thank you guys for watching, I really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe and leave your opinions in the comments below. But until the next video my friends, goodbye.